Welcome to the Biltmore Church podcast. Our church exists to glorify God by making disciples of Jesus who reach up, reach in, and reach out. And this podcast is a resource that will hopefully help you do just that. Want to say happy Thanksgiving. This comes out on Wednesday, so for those of you who are gearing up for Thanksgiving and making that last-minute trip to the grocery store, hope you have a great Thanksgiving. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. We're in the final week of our 4-week teaching series about the book of 2 Peter called Follow Your Heart and Other Lies We Believe. My name is Christian Cooper. I serve on staff here, and I'm here today with our lead pastor, Bruce Frank, and Tyler Flores, who serves on our communications and production team. Now, with the holiday week coming up this week, we're actually recording this on Sunday. Little peek behind the curtain. We're recording this Sunday at like 12:30, coming off of a full morning of services. I say that because if we say something really silly or I just zone out, it's because we got that Sunday morning.
If you hear a loud thump, it's one of our heads dropping to the table because we're just that exhausted.
But we're excited. We're going to do it today. It's going to be a great discussion today. We're going to be answering some of your questions that you've been submitting to us at that podcast at biltmorechurch.com email over the last several weeks. I cannot wait to cover some of these in a Q&A. But first, let's do some Sunday recap.
Yeah, for us, it's very fresh. Like I said, we literally just came out from the worship center. Pastor Bruce, something that really stood out to me from what you said today was you spent a minute when you were talking about Jonah and how he felt about the Ninevites, and then you sort of related that to us. And we need to feel about the people around us the way Jesus felt about the Israelites, not the way Jonah felt about the Ninevites, and you sort of mentioned how the command to not be of the world is not a command to step back. It's we love the world. It's not the things in it. It's the people in it. And I was just thinking about how we use that word love so much, and you could go down a deep rabbit hole, all the different kinds of love. But if the command is to love the people around the way Jesus loved the Israelites, that was there was no deeper. There could be no deeper love. It wasn't surface level. Like when he says, "Oh Jerusalem, how I long to gather you as a hen would gather her chicks." Like it is so like heart-wrenching love. The only kind of love I can think is to compare it to the way I love my kids or the way I love my wife or my family. And I just got hit between the eyes. Like, do the people that I walk by on the street, the people that I disagree with, that those elections were recently, and I'm just like, oh, you people, you're all crazy. Do I love the people who sit across the aisle from me politically the same way that I love my family? Is it that deep? Is it that soul-rending sort of love that I would do anything? And the answer is no, I do not. So I don't know that I really even have a question built in there. It's just, these are my reflections.
Yeah.
What I was hit between the eyes. It was just like, I have so much further to go in loving people well, because I'm not there.
Well, and when John says don't love the world, sometimes it's very difficult for us to separate the world, which is not talking about the people, it's talking about the world systems, the world value system. We don't love that. But it's not that you don't love the people. And then somebody might say, well, Jesus also spoke very bluntly to the world. Of course he did. So that was actually just a throwaway line that actually I remembered because my wife did an awesome tweet a couple weeks ago. But the idea, I would say for that, our perspective, what is your heart? Jonah's heart, he didn't want to do it. If you read the book of Jonah, he didn't want to do it. He didn't like the Ninevites. And he got depressed when God actually gave them mercy, which was indicative of what his heart was to begin with. As for Jesus, he would preach, as I said earlier today, he spoke more about judgment than anybody, all the rest of the guys combined, but his heart was, he loved the people. All right, he didn't compromise, he didn't do anything, but he loved the people. And obviously, our command is that. We don't love the world systems. We don't love even the quote culture, because culture is all a culture is the widely held set of beliefs and values.
Right.
That's all a culture is, a widely held set of beliefs and values. And so we don't love that. We're distinct from that. That's part of holiness. But in our day and time, especially with Twitter and all that stuff, very easy for us to confuse the stuff we don't like, whether that be the politics or the people, and all of a sudden it meshes into we stereotype and hate people groups. Yeah, whether it be so anyway, and we all struggle with that.
Yeah, that big idea, it seemed to be kind of throughout the message today about again, a lot of times when we talk about these topics, like today, talking about kind of, end time stuff in 2 Peter, the temptation is to be like, yeah, and point it outward at the world instead of kind of pointing it inward at us. And what does that mean? So that back half being so application, I thought was great. My favorite part of the message today was getting to hear you sing that nursery rhyme, the Noah nursery rhyme. We need a recording of that.
Sung again. Yeah, I don't even.
We're not going to get a private performance.
What do the ark? The animals go on 2 by 2. First the hippopotamus, then the kangaroo.
Yeah, and then it goes to 3 by 3, which doesn't make any sense because that's not how it happens.
You've got to teach your kids to count while you're also teaching them about the ark.
There's a lot going on there.
Yeah, there's a lot. Yeah.
But in all seriousness, the quote for me that really kind of stopped me and got me really processing was the guy, I can't remember his name, who you mentioned, who lived through that genocide.
Yeah,
and
Miroslav Volf.
Yeah, I'm not even going to try. You nailed it. So
Yeah,
why
no,
do
I'm
I
just.
need to
I mean,
repeat it?
I've used him a couple times before, but it is, and there's a couple of things like that. I remember reading some stuff about a genocide in Africa, and I can't remember the name of that book, but it's very similar in regards to he saw unbelievable stuff, and the only way he could forgive is realizing God's a God of justice and mercy, but he's not a God who just overlooks stuff. In his case, he saw folks in his village just get completely wiped out in the most brutal of ways.
And just to tie that in with how important and how that's really the only thing, God's justice is the only thing that makes forgiveness possible. It's interesting. You don't often hear kind of that end times idea tied so closely with forgiveness, but that's really what it's about in some ways, is extending that forgiveness to other people. So, hey, make sure you go back, watch the message, listen to the message. If you weren't here with us on Sunday today, used to saying that on Monday or Tuesday, but another great week. This series, we've gone through the last 4 weeks through this book. I was really curious to see how it was going to go, just reading through it a few times, and man, I feel like our people have been built up so much through God's Word over the last few weeks. So I'm glad you've been on this journey with us. All right, today we're going to be doing a little Q&A, some Ask PB, Ask Pastor Bruce, and we've got some great questions here I'm excited to get into. Thank you guys so much for emailing these in, your comments, your questions, your thoughts over the last few weeks. So we're just going to jump right in. A lot of these have to do with things that we've talked about on the podcast over the last few weeks, things from your message, or just, faith-related things in general. So question number 1, I love the teaching that the whole Bible is about Jesus. Can you give me some examples of how we can find Jesus specifically in the Old Testament?
Yeah, and I think, one of the things you look at in general, probably the preeminent text is what the end of Luke's gospel, where Jesus actually takes the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus and he explains to them, and he kind of talks about how he showed them himself in all of the scriptures. And so that would have been a cool Bible study to be, to be a part of. But, you start off in Genesis 3 with the prophecy where he's like, I'm going to send the serpent crusher. I'm going to do that. And again, the easily way you see that is you see everything. You can see it from the way the New Testament will quote the Old Testament, and saying that Jesus was the fulfillment of that. You see it from Jesus's own confession when he says, like, you guys look, he's talking to the religious leaders. You thought life was just in the words, but you didn't realize the words are talking to me, about me. But the Psalm 22 is the super, it's a blow by blow description of the crucifixion, is a example that, even in there, it's like, well, my God, why have you forsaken me? So even when Jesus is on the cross, he's doing what's called a rabbinical remez, which is the idea of it's kind of like little hints we do to bring a verse to mind. It's like if you were trying to memorize John 3:16 and you couldn't remember it, somebody might say, for God so loved, and loved the world that he gave his own. And so even when Jesus is on the cross, what does he do? He brings back Psalm 22 while he's dying on the cross, so that the Jewish people who are watching him get crucified, they're like, oh, he's doing Psalm 22. That's what Psalm 22 was ultimately talking about. So, there's tons of that stuff. I would say this, and I think we have another question like this, there was an original meaning for that. So in other words, it's a mixture of it is all about Jesus, but there was also a context in which it was written in.
That's great.
So, it's asking the questions, what did it mean then? So the whole thing was not specifically taught. It was always alluding, but sometimes it's in shadows, sometimes it's in symbols, sometimes it's in pictures, sometimes it's super obvious, like Psalm 22, sometimes it's not that obvious. So all that being said, those are some examples, but ask, what did it mean then? What does it mean now? What does it mean to me personally? Those are, I could say that all the time because it really helps people understand how to read the Bible in context. What did it mean then to a particular people group, and then what does it mean now? And then what does it mean to me personally?
Yeah.
I think too, and this is, I want to be careful and say this the right way, but I think something that's also helped me when reading stories specifically in the Old Testament is I look for the hero in the story and work really, because I think if we were brought up in church, a lot of times the habit is to find the hero, whatever the hero of the story is, and to put myself into the hero's place and say, well, what did the hero learn? Now I'm going to learn that thing. And as I've journeyed through the Old Testament through my life, I've found that more often that hero figure is an analogy, never a perfect analogy, but an analogy for some character trait of God himself.
Certainly.
And if you want to find yourself in that story, find the person cowering in the corner, find the person who's actively in rebellion in the story, and that's probably the representation of yourself in that story.
Well, yeah, I mean, David and Goliath is a classic example. What do we like to do? We like to think, be a David. No, actually, we're the cowering Israelites up on the hill. All right, so but then the reason that's important is because if somebody thinks, whatever, I'm a David, what happens when their giant slays them? I know there's a question about Romans 8 here in a few minutes, but what happens when, because if you do that, it's like, hey, you're David and, be a David and slay your giant. Well, what happens when the giant slays you? I mean, but when you realize Jesus has already slayed the giant, then it flips the whole thing on its.
It's a deeper meaning.
Yeah, and but to be clear, there are people we can learn from. 1 Corinthians says some of that stuff, like the book of Numbers, was written as an example for you. So there's some things we learn, both good and bad examples. It's not like you can't learn from it. It's just when you go overboard, it ends up becoming moralism and versus the gospel. So and that's why we say the only real hero in the Bible is Jesus. Because when you look, whether you take Noah, Abraham, you dig deep enough, there's very few that don't have some really bad stuff in their closet.
Yeah.
There's an occasional one you don't see much, maybe like a Daniel. But I mean, you get there's some crates, like it's much more like Jerry Springer than it is Andy Griffith. So
that's a great way to put it. Yeah, I think the really easy way for me practically has been Tim Keller's like classic line through a lot of that stuff is like, Jesus is the truer and greater Abraham, truer and greater Moses. So even in characters, you can find
and he's taking that phrase out of Hebrews, and that's probably that's a penultimate book there to understand how Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament, is the book of Hebrews.
That's great.
So if you read the book of Hebrews, you will see that over and over and over again. It's why Jesus, he is the truer and better. Book of Hebrews feels Old Testament, but if you haven't read the Old Testament, if you read the book of Hebrews, it'll feel like a bridge between the Old and the New Testament.
Love that. Okay, next question. You've mentioned that in the Old Testament there are various types of laws, ceremonial, civil, moral law. How can we know which specific laws no longer apply today and which do? Basically, which ones fall into what category?
Sure, and I would say you're not going to see it listed like, okay, I'm now going into the moral law, so to speak. But some of them you can see, like, easy way to look at it is 10 Commandments are moral laws. And one of the ways you can tell is, are they repeated in the New Testament? So like all the 10 Commandments, save Sabbath day, are repeated in the New Testament. And so obviously there's a moral idea of that. And as a matter of fact, a lot of them are in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus would take it and actually raise the bar. So moral law were just things based on the characteristic of God. Civil law, you can tell because it's contextually, it's about the nation of Israel.
Right.
He's setting up a nation. They come out of 400 years of slavery. He's setting up a nation. And so they have things like, okay, how do you take people who have had no law and then set them up for how do you run a country, so to speak?
Yep.
And then the ceremonial law, that's probably the easiest because but it's also the one that people use kind of against Christians the most to say we cherry pick it, because they'll like take the book of Leviticus and they'll talk about fabrics and shellfish and I mean you hear
trimming your beard
and all that stuff, and you got to look. It's a little harder to see, but if you see it tied into the character of God or tied into something he's trying to teach them. He's teaching them an overall thing, especially with the sacrificial system. He's saying sin is costly, and he's actually introducing the whole idea of a substitute. It's like, all right, sin is costly, and so it's going to cost you in that case a ram or a bull or doves or whatever. And so he's already introducing sin does cost, and there is at least the idea of a substitute, somebody else can pay for that. And then obviously Jesus is the fulfillment. So again, I would say the short answer is you learn that from context, which means you read one of the best, I don't even know if he says it those three ways, but probably the book of Galatians is the New Testament book that helps that the most.
It's great.
And then there's a book, I don't even know if it's in print anymore, but 30 Days to Understanding the Bible by a guy named Max Anders. Goes through geography of the Bible, the structure of the Bible. I'm not sure if he talks, I would be shocked if he didn't give enough context to realize what's the difference between civil, moral, and ceremonial.
Yeah, there's definitely a law section. I use that book for every single context corner. So if you haven't read it, it's fantastic, very practical, and it's not like a long read. It's interactive.
I mean, it literally is 30. My boys did it in junior high.
Yeah.
So, if they did it in junior high, I can promise you anybody listening can do it.
Yep. Okay, next question. What Bible translation would you recommend for daily reading?
Great question. I would say, I use the English Standard Version. I would let me dig a little bit broader. I would use the Bible you use all the time. There's basically 2 to 3 ways that Bibles are there. There's a paraphrase. There's one because you can't do word for word because a Greek word might take us 3 words to say it. So not to get in the weeds here, but you've got paraphrases that are like the Message, and they have a place. That's not what I would use for a daily Bible because that is almost thought for thought. Okay, what we want to try to get is a translation is as close to word for word as you can get. Some are more wooden than others, but even the most wooden, like New American Standard or ESV, is only about an 8th grade reading level. So most people can read that. But the idea is the word for word is close to word for word. ESV, New American Standard, New King James, those are ones that are all very much literal, word for word. The ones in between that, you got the paraphrase over here, you've got really strong literal translations over here. In the middle is probably stuff like the NIV. It's kind of in the middle. Don't send me any hate mail. It is what it is. And it's a good translation. It's not the one I would recommend. Again, you don't have to trade it in. It's a good translation, but I think the best ones are going to be one of those 3, either New American Standard, ESV is one I use, and then New King James is good. And obviously King James is good. It's just hard to understand sometimes because it was translated in the Elizabethan English, and that's not the way we speak anymore. Yeah. That's what New King James tried to do. But they all use the most current manuscript evidence. They had word for word philosophy in translating it. NIV was a little more, it wasn't really, they don't say thought for thought, but it's somewhere in between. So answer your question, I would use a Bible that one of those 3 is your everyday because you can understand it. It might take a little more work, and the other ones are a paraphrase, and sometimes they're not saying exactly, and especially when it goes down to what is our philosophy about the Bible. Our philosophy is that, and our theology is that God inspired every word, and every word matters. There's nothing there by accident.
That's so helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a fun one. As someone who has young kids, I find it really difficult to find time to read my Bible. What would you recommend to help create space for this on a daily basis? Tyler, I know you actively have young kids, so feel free to jump in as well.
I do. I think the reality of having young kids, but it's different. It's a phase of your life. But what I have found in having young kids is that really it's an extension of habits that I already have. So I don't want to discard the question and say, well, you have the answer inside of you all along. That's not what I want to say. I think what it boils down to is that my kids take up a ton of my time, and I felt as soon as they began to move, like as soon as they began to crawl, I found my time like disappearing. If they were out of bed, then it felt like there was no more me time. And then when they went to bed, I felt this need like, okay, if they're asleep, now I have to get all the things done that I wasn't able to get done while they were up. So therefore, now I have no time left. That's the default space. But I think if we're really honest with ourselves, I think the truth of it is I still make time for Netflix. I make time for my spouse. I make time to do the things I care about. Mm-hmm. So it's not, I don't think that having young kids gives you no time left. I think what it does is it forces you to drop something, and you've got to choose what's the most priority thing to you. So if you're saying, I don't have time to read the Bible, my pushback in love is that you have not prioritized the Bible. That for you, the Bible is not the most important thing to you. Spending time with God is not super high. And if you've got time to do other things, then you need to drop one of them. That's really how I feel.
I mean, for sure. And it does get harder in some regards because you don't have it. You sometimes don't have ownership of it if you're changing diapers, so to speak. So I would say a couple of the other, besides, you definitely have to prioritize it. That might be getting up early, staying up later, turning off, Yellowstone, whatever. If somebody watched that,
we need to have a whole episode about Yellowstone because that's the second and third time.
But I would say another thing is don't discount. Like the other day, I'd forgotten. So I was in the car, instead of putting on even worship music, I stuck on my ESV, had my ESV, the verbal app, and you can do Dwell or whatever. And I forgot like Getty, one of the Gettys was doing the verbal thing. I'd forgotten how awesome it is to hear it. And in her case, it was I think, Scottish or Irish or something. So it's kind of a cool.
Choose your accent.
It's kind of a cool deal. But my point would be, don't discount listening. So maybe you're having to change the diaper, do the dishes, or fix it, whatever. Instead of having nothing, or even praise music, as great as that is, that's not the replacement. Just put that up in there, and just listening to the Word, which is how they did it before we had our printed Bibles anyway. Either somebody spoke it, they didn't have Dwell at the time, but somebody's reading it to them. So don't discount. I was amazed at how much I recalled listening, and then it actually just whet my appetite to jump back in there. And I listened to 10 or 11 chapters in the car the other day of the Gospel of Matthew. I was like, that was very refreshing.
And now we're going to go through Matthew in our next series. We're going to pivot to that now. I'm just kidding.
Nope.
Yeah, no, that's a really good idea for anyone who's listening. Even if you don't have young kids, that's a great opportunity. And in fact, we as a church, we've got a Dwell that we've kind of gifted to our people.
Yeah.
So if you don't have that, we can get that to you. It's on our website. You can subscribe, get free Dwell, so you can listen to it whenever you want.
Yep.
Okay, here's a question that we've kind of been circling for a few weeks. We've mentioned it kind of secondary. Would love to just ask the question straight up today. What can I say to someone who believes that not everyone and everything written in the Bible actually lived or occurred, that they are allegories rather than God-inspired truth?
Sure. I think if I heard it right, what can I say to someone else who says that? I would say
that's how I'm reading it as well.
And first of all, if somebody asks you that question, don't get defensive, don't freak out, don't say, I believe it, that settles it, because they're asking a legitimate question, and it's a question you need to be able to answer. In general, I would lovingly just talk about, how do you read there's certain things in language that you look at that shows you what type, at least most of the time, tells you what type of genre is what she's saying. What kind of genre? Is it allegory? Is it metaphor? Is it a parable? Is it narrative? Is it history? Is it poetry? On all those things, most of those things I just listed are in the Bible. I mean, there's a whole section in the Bible right in the middle that is poetry. I mean, it is poetry. And so I would affirm, it's like, I would say something, hey, thank you for even just being interested. And I would go back to Anders' deal. Anders is that Max Anders, 30 Days to Understand the Bible. The short answer would be, to be fair, you want to read it as it is plainly understood. And about 90% of it is very clear. So for example, if they're listing names and genealogies and histories and stuff, that is obviously not an allegory. They're trying to tell you, here is the way this is broken down. Matthew starts his gospel, all that, and he's not writing that because it's like, oh, this is awesome reading. He's trying to make a point. Luke does the same thing. He starts off, Luke has a 2-volume set. He has the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. And he's like, I've written these things to have an accurate account. So the short answer is read it like it plainly comes across. And some of it plainly comes across as history. I mean, the nation of Israel. He is writing a historical account. There's names of kings. There's all that kind of stuff. There's a few books that you're like, all right, I wouldn't go to getting a battle over it. You just, because it's not essential. What I would say is essential is like the resurrection. The resurrection is clearly not written as an allegory. And there are churches that teach that. He's risen in our hearts, or he's risen, metaphorically. That's not the way that was written. I mean, it's not. That's not even the message of the book of Acts. I mean, they all died clinging to that message,
Right.
saying, "Listen, we saw him. We saw him. We went there. They didn't expect it." So I would say, just to be fair, if you get not an argument, if you're getting in a deal, to be fair with any ancient literature, read it as it appears that the writer meant it. And that's obviously, there's some parts that's, again, there's Proverbs, Psalms. You have a few that are a little harder to read, that are harder to tell. Some people can make an argument about Song of Solomon, those kind of things. But those are few. Most of them are real clear. This is the way it's written. This, Jesus, when he would tell a parable, those had certain rules to them. You could kind of tell it's a parable because he introduced it like that a lot of times. There's not names of people in parables very often. There's a few. That's why, like the rich man and Lazarus, people are like, is that a parable? Is that real? Well, he doesn't usually name people like Lazarus. Right. So I would say, use the rules that are there for all types of genre of literature that are, to be fair to the Bible. Read it like you would any ancient literature, and how's the writer writing it?
Yeah, I think one thing to help drive it home too is that all those different genres and types of writing, whether they are a literal historical thing in some of those cases, or whether they're like a parable that is allegorical in a sense, they all communicate truth.
Sure.
So it kind of, I want to be careful about how I say it, but it does a little bit kind of say, hey, regardless on some of these that we can disagree on and still have fellowship, they all communicate a truth, and that's important.
Certainly. So, and if you're a Christ follower, how did Jesus look at that truth? Because Jesus refers to the Old Testament all the time. So when he talks about it, so for example, in Matthew 19, to set biblical sexuality, he goes back to Genesis, and everything in it. He's not talking about that in some kind of once upon a time. Mm-hmm. He's setting everything up based on the original marriage, and there's nothing that Jesus says in any way that would say anything other than that was, a real persons with a real marriage. So anyway, that's those are just a few hints.
Awesome. Okay, one of the daily promise texts was Romans 8:28. I'm just going to read it just so we all have it. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. Does that direct the promise to a specific audience? I don't understand who that audience is. As a Christ follower, may I claim that promise?
Yes, because you can look at who was Romans written to. It was written to Christians. I would just, when you get a promise like Romans 8:28, make sure you understand the immediate context. It is very much a valid one for the Christian, but just realize that one of all the promises can sometime act like, well, it's all good, and it's not good. I think the key verse is not just to read verse 28, it's to read verse 29, because verse 28 says, for those who are called according to his purpose. So you got to ask the question, what's his purpose? Verse 29 says, for those whom he foreknew, he predestined to be conformed to the image of his son. So in other words, he's saying these circumstances, they might stink at times. I mean, ultimately, they're going to turn out good, but he's like, I'm going to use even the bad stuff for my purpose. What's his purpose? To make you and I look more like Jesus. And so, Christian, he might put you in a situation where it's like with a difficult person, like Tyler, and you're having a very hard time, like, loving Tyler. That was a joke. Sorry. He puts you in a very hard.
It hit too close to home. No, I'm just kidding.
So he puts you in a hard
so
situation that's hard to love somebody, and you're like,
right.
I just want out of that situation. Well, guess what? He's teaching you. If he's conforming you to the image of his son, he is probably teaching you how to love people by putting you with a person who is not as easy to love. It's easy for you to love Ashley, your wife, but if Tyler's a knucklehead, he's like, okay, but so Romans 8:28, valid, 100%. Just make sure you read verse 29.
That's great.
And I think it bears repeating that the good that Paul was always running after, always, like when he talked about this good, I'm reaching for this thing. It was always Jesus. Yeah. It was always like, I want to know him more. Ultimately, he pushed for resurrection. Why? He wanted to be resurrected so he could just know Jesus more. He's like, hey, you know what? I think on the other side of this thing, I'm going to get to know Jesus more than I'm capable of in this earthly body. So yeah, I'm pushing for resurrection. It was always about Jesus. So I think that you already said it, but it bears repeating that the good is always going to orbit Jesus. If the good in your mind, when you read that verse, is like, okay, all things are work together for good, and you've got something else beside Jesus at the center of that, then it's likely you're you're skewing that, and you're painting the verse into your life in a way that doesn't fit.
Yeah, and for the listener, we have a whole series. We have 4 weeks where we did nothing but go through Romans 8.
That's right.
So I can't remember what it's called. Greatest chapter in the Bible.
Yeah.
That was called. One thing that stuck out to me way back in the study is that phrase "work together." It's where we get our word synergy from, which means it doesn't say everything is good. It says he can take both. He's so sovereign and so big, he can take the good and the bad, and he can synergize them. He can bring them together for your good. So
that's good, for lack of a
Oh, no.
Sorry. I'm so sorry. It was already coming out of my mouth, and I just couldn't stop it.
All right, a question about giving here. A couple weeks ago, you talked about tithing, grace giving, some of the debates surrounding some of that. So what would you recommend for somebody who wants to make generosity a more consistent part of their life? Would you, there's that kind of both and spectrum there, but I think just practically, what would you give someone?
Yeah, I mean, I think generosity of life, because generosity is such a subjective term. Somebody might think they're generous if they give $1 tip to a waitress, and they think they're generous. And so the scale is big. So giving and generosity is an enormous subject in the Bible, enormous subject. I mean, 16 parables Jesus said had to do, of his 36 had to do with generosity and or how we use our resources. I will give you a great chapter. There's a great chapter by my buddy J.D. Greer in his book Gospel, and I don't remember what chapter it is, but it was basically gospel-filled generosity or some chapter in his book. He does a matrix, which is really, really good. He takes like 5 or 6 different, kind of like a grid on how you see generosity. So that's going to be the best answer in a great way. But I would say also Colossians 1 just says that he might be preeminent in all things, meaning that he just gets your first and your best. Contrast that with, let's say, Malachi, about when Malachi was talking about how their worship was so bad. And the reason was, he's like, you give better to your governors. In other words, you give leftovers to God. So that's why I say first and best.
Yeah.
And again, it goes back to the grace giving and the tithing and so forth. And that's the comment a few weeks ago was 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, which I think is what JD's chapter is mainly about. Is about God was gracious toward us, so we want to be gracious toward people. And that includes our resources. And that's where I said a few weeks ago, people who say, well, the tithe is not in effect anymore. And if somebody believes that, that's fine. I do. Jesus did commend. He didn't command. You don't see a place in the New Testament he commands it. You do see him commending the Pharisees. And when he says, you do all these things, you tithe on the mint and the dill, and you do all this. You're so careful with this, but you forget the bigger things. And so he didn't put the tithe down. He's like, it's good what you do. It's good what you do, but you've forgotten the heart behind it. So my point would be, I still think the tithe is a great training wheels. I think that's not the beginning point of generosity. It's the training wheels you put on a bike, but generosity has to mean more than that, both with your time, your influence that God gives you, and certainly your resources. So again, I'd give him that chapter out of JD's book. I get no kickback from that sale, but it's a great book. But it's a great book, and it's a great chapter in which you can kind of look at the big picture, because the Bible teaches you save some, you spend some, and you share some. But that gives you a grid. So nothing wrong with saving it. Proverbs talks about it's good to save. Learn from the ant, puts away in the abundant times, so he has some in the scarce times. There's nothing, even inheritance, it's okay to give, have an inheritance waiting for you. Obviously, it's okay to spend some. 1 Timothy chapter 6 talks about, listen, God's a good God. He likes his kids to enjoy some stuff.
Right.
But then also share some. And that's where that chapter will help with.
I learned a lot just asking those questions, getting to hear some of those responses. I hope for everyone watching, for everyone listening, that you did as well. Again, we're answering questions not for information's sake, but so you can grow as a follower of Jesus. That's really the point of this whole podcast. We want to help you grow. And so before we wrap up, I want to remind you, we're continuing our conversation over the course of this thing, so keep sending us your questions at podcast@biltmorechurch.com. We'd love to discuss some of them along the way. Obviously, we spent a lot of time discussing some today. And then also, many of you have been taking part in our daily promises texting resource over the last 4 weeks, and so we have decided we're going to keep that going, and we're going to try to help you prepare for Christmas. So we're going to have a new daily Advent text coming out starting on December the 1st. So if you're already in our Promises group, you'll be in on this one as well. But if not, make sure you jump in that Promises. We're also going to have it set up to where you can text the word Advent to 28282 and be in that group as well. And some of those verses, even some of the things we talked about today, some of those verses are Old Testament examples of preparing the way for Jesus. And so you're going to see that each and every day. Again, you can anchor your day on those things as well. And then lastly, want to give you a heads up that we're going to be taking a short break on the episodes here over the next few weeks as we gear up for Christmas, the holiday season. But don't worry, because we are going to be back at it in 2023, hoping to bring you some more helpful content to help you follow Jesus. But I want to say thank you so much for taking the time every week to listen to this, to watch this, to share this with your friends. Obviously, we've put a lot of time into this so that it can help you, and it's been great to just hear from you all. So many people have reached out to let us know how helpful this has been, and that is a thing that you don't often get to see in ministry. But this has been such a blessing for me, and so I hope it's been a blessing for you listening and watching. And as always, we are going to end this thing. I'm not going to do what I did last week, which is try to get us all to say at the same time. So last episode for a few weeks, so I will close us up. As always, you are loved and sent.